This is episode 200 of the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast. Hooray, Sarah.
Yay, Josh. Good job.
And I'm Josh Hutchinson.
This is Sarah Jack. Before Salem, there was Connecticut. Decades before the trials that everyone knows, that colony's courts were already convicting men and women of witchcraft. Alice Young of Windsor was the first, hanged in 1647, the first person executed for witchcraft anywhere in the American colonies.
And 10 more would follow her to the gallows, convicted and condemned by the courts of colonial Connecticut, and then left for more than 3 centuries without exoneration, without a memorial, without much of anyone remembering their names.
That changed. In 2023, Connecticut formally absolved the accused, and this podcast was part of how that happened, putting their names and their history back into the public record where they belonged.
But the witch hunt did not end in colonial Connecticut, and it has not ended anywhere. You can see it right now. People are being accused, banished, tortured, and killed for witchcraft today on multiple continents, and most of the world is not paying attention. The same logic that hanged Alice Young is still taking lives. That is the thing this show exists to confront.
So the podcast conversation went where the story went. Out of Connecticut, across New England, back to the places where these trials began, through folklore and pop culture, and into the present-day crisis. 200 episodes in, people in more than 100 countries have listened and watched, and more than 175 guests have come to the table from around the world, and we appreciate each one of them for joining us.
They are historians and authors, lawyers and legal experts who understand what these prosecutions actually are. Faith leaders, medical professionals, mental health advocates, artists, playwrights, students, researchers, and advocates working in communities. Survivors who live this now. Descendants who carry these histories in their own families. Leaders working on this at the level of the United Nations. Across borders, centuries, and beliefs, this podcast has become one of the few places where the whole arc of the witch hunt, then and now, is actually being talked about. Thank you to all of our guests.
We really appreciate you. This podcast is not just for witch hunts as history, but it's to confront them as a continued reality and to make sure the accused are heard. The ones convicted centuries ago and the ones standing accused today.
200 episodes. Let's look at where witch hunts came from and where they are today. One thing we established early on is that witch hunting goes back thousands of years, well before early modern Europe or colonial America.
The practice occurred all across the ancient world and continued right through the classical era. In fact, if you look at ancient Mesopotamia, witches have been mentioned in some of the earliest human writings, dating as far back as the 3rd millennium BCE.
In the classical period, there are documented trials and prosecutions of magicians in both ancient Greece and ancient Rome.
Classical sources frequently mention dangerous magical beings and witch-like figures, such as Circe and Medea, demonstrating that virtually every culture throughout history has had some form of persecutorial tendency when it comes to magic.
Following the classical period, the Middle Ages proved to be a time of relatively few witch trials. Magic has been employed throughout recorded history, and the medieval period was no different, with magic workers being employed for services like healing, love magic, and divination. The difference is that the church in the Middle Ages viewed these practices as relatively benign superstitions, which required penance, not prison or death. The age of witch trials did not begin until the late Middle Ages and ran through the early modern period. In our episodes, we have learned about the church's attitude in the 10th century, for instance, when the canon Episcopi was produced, revealing the church's skepticism about common witchcraft beliefs.
And that skepticism was remarkably direct. The canon Episcopi, a key medieval church law dating to approximately 906 CE, which condemned the belief in physical witchcraft and nocturnal flight as illusions and heresies, that the belief that women flew at night with the Roman goddess Diana was an illusion, something the devil planted in their minds. At that point, believing that physical night flight actually happened was itself considered heretical. The text said that anyone who believed those flights were real was, in its words, beyond doubt an infidel.
So the witch in that earlier picture is a solitary figure, someone using illicit magic out of greed or lust, seen mostly as a danger to herself rather than part of any organized sect.
Then attitudes start moving. As the church became more focused on rooting out heresy in the 12th century, the Inquisition was established in 1183 to police belief. In the 13th century, theologians like Thomas Aquinas developed demonology, the study of the nature and operations of demons, and inquisitors like Conrad of Marburg began reporting on alleged secret groups of devil worshippers who mocked Christian rites.
And the real transformation, the one we keep circling back to across the show, lands in the 15th century with what historians call the elaborated or cumulative conception of witchcraft. This is the framework that radically redefined what a witch was.
Before this, a witch was the solitary person using simple, harmful magic, maleficium, for personal reasons, a threat to herself or a neighbor. Under the elaborated theory, the witch became a willing partner with the devil and an active member of a vast, secret, anti-Christian conspiracy.
It hinged on a few terrifying tenets. The first tenet was the diabolical pact. The theory held that witches had no innate powers of their own. Every ability came directly from Satan, and to get it, the would-be witch had to make a formal pact, renouncing allegiance to God, swearing loyalty to the devil, often consummating that agreement through intercourse with him.
The second tenet was the witch's sabbath. Witches were believed to travel through the air to massive secret nighttime gatherings, originally called the Synagogue of Satan, later the Sabbath, presided over by demons or the devil himself. At these assemblies, they supposedly held debauched orgies, mocked Christian sacraments, confessed the evil they had done over the past year, and swapped recipes for poisons and ointments. The accounts even described an atrocious feast that included the boiled or roasted flesh of murdered infants.
And the third tenet is the scale of the threat, because witchcraft was no longer a local personal crime but a coordinated plot to subvert God's creation and replace the church with the devil's kingdom. The witch became an existential danger to both church and state.
Historians trace this to the 1430s around the Council of Basel, where major churchmen from different regions had gathered and started swapping stories about heretics and magic. That is where the early texts come from.
Hans Freund wrote an account around 1429 or 1430 documenting trials in the Valais, in what's now Switzerland. That began in 1428 and ended in more than 100 executions. Freund alleged the witches were so numerous and powerful that, left unchecked, they might raise their own king from among their ranks.
Then Claude Tholosson, a chief royal magistrate in Briançon, France, wrote a treatise in 1436. He argued the witches were not only violating religious standards, they were committing treason against the French monarch, making them a threat to church and state both. His writing gives lurid detail about the synagogue of witches claiming they killed and ate children, paid an annual tribute to the devil, and made poisonous powders that turned them invisible. He also said the devil would appear as whatever the witch wanted to see him appear as, to put them at ease.
The Aurorus Gazariorum, an anonymous text from around 1436, likely tied to trials in the Val d'Aosta region in Italy, was possibly written by the Franciscan inquisitor Ponce Figueron. It described the synagogue of Satan, oaths of loyalty, homage to the devil, orgies, and witches boiling infants to make a potion that, rubbed on a staff, let them fly. It even included the allegation that witches would sacrifice a red-headed Catholic.
And Johann Nieder's Formicarius, written between 1436 and 1438, offered second-hand accounts from a secular judge named Peter of Bern about trials in Switzerland. It described a group smothering infants in their beds and digging up the bodies and boiling them for their ceremonies. And this is the important one. Nieder was the first cleric writer to explicitly say women were more prone to being seduced into witchcraft than men. That set a heavy gendered precedent.
There's also the Vaudery of Lyon from the 1430s, painting a monstrous devil with fire coming out of its eyes and ears.
All these stories were standardized late in the 1480s by the most notorious and harmful manual of all, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, in 1486 and 1487. It was authored by the Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer, also called Instauratus, and with Jacobus Springer's name attached to lend it university credibility.
And the Malleus did something clever and dangerous. It circumvented the older skepticism, the canon episcopi line, by arguing that the denial of witchcraft's reality was itself a heresy. It cemented profound misogyny into witch hunting, using a false etymology of the Latin word femina to claim women had less faith and were naturally susceptible to Satan. It also worked as a practical guide for judges how to run the trial, how to extract confessions through torture, how to bypass normal legal protections, because witchcraft was now treated as an exceptional crime, a crimen exceptum.
Amplified by the newly invented printing press, the Malleus convinced educated elites that witches were actively working to destroy Christian society. That laid the ideological groundwork for the massive hunts that swept through Europe, and it fed directly into the fears that eventually drove Salem. We literally see beliefs from the Malleus playing out in attacks against innocent people today in 2026. The missing manhood allegations are rampant this year in some African countries, and that comes straight out of the Malleus.
On the European continent, witchcraft was frequently treated as a heresy, which meant torture and execution by burning. England took a different path.
In 1542, King Henry VIII enacted the first English Witchcraft Act, and the key move was that it made witchcraft a secular felony rather than a religious heresy. That distinction mattered enormously, as a felony suspects in England were entitled to a trial by jury, could not be subjected to inquisitorial torture, and were hanged rather than burned at the stake.
And Henry's motivation wasn't really a fear of the devil. He believed people were using magic to illegally locate and steal buried treasure and gold that he felt rightfully belonged to the crown.
The historical persuasive writing is its own through line. The text, pamphlets, and demonologies from theologians, skeptics, and magistrates were the writings that built the framework that fueled the hunts in court and eventually helped dismantle them. Here is a few of them.
Demonology in 1597 established what it called sufficient proofs, like familiar spirits, for magistrates to use in court to prove witchcraft. King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, wrote it after he believed witches had summoned storms to drown his bride, and it set the focus on the demonic pact for England and Scotland.
Then William Perkins' A Discourse of the Damned Art of Witchcraft in 1608 was highly influential, with detailed descriptions of the diabolical pact. Perkins argued that good witches, the healers and cunning folk, were actually the most dangerous kind, because the devil used them deceptively to expand his kingdom.
Richard Bernard's A Guide to Grand Jurymen in 1627 was addressed practically to the jurymen who had to evaluate and prosecute these cases. And then Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed witchfinder general, published The Discovery of Witches in 1647. He detailed his interrogation methods from the East Anglia witch hunts, including sleep deprivation to see if familiars appeared, and the searching for the witch's teat, where the familiars allegedly fed. His witch hunt was later fiercely mocked in Samuel Butler's satirical poem Hudibras in the 1660s.
And running against all of that, you have some skeptics. Johann Weyer's treatise in the 1560s is considered one of the first skeptical accounts of witch trials. This Dutch physician argued that while the devil was real, many of the accused women were simply suffering from melancholy or delusion and needed medical treatment rather than punishment. That may sound like a better opinion, but it is still misogynistic and accusational.
Reginald Scott took it further in his The Discovery of Witchcraft in 1584. He was one of the most extreme skeptics of his era. He argued the devil was entirely immaterial and could only influence the mind, and he attributed the supposed physical harm of any afflicted persons to natural phenomena, deception, or melancholy.
There is a cluster of texts tied directly to Salem, spanning roughly 1681 to 1702. Joseph Glanville's Sadducismus Triumphatus from 1681 was written to push back against emerging skepticism. He attempted to scientifically prove that evil spirits existed in order to defend Christianity against naturalists who doubted the supernatural. While Glanville was more interested in proving the spirit world existed than in actually prosecuting witches, later editions of his work inadvertently fueled the Salem witch trials. These editions added an appendix detailing the Swedish witch trials, introducing sensational accounts of the witches' Sabbath that heavily influenced the imaginations of Salem's magistrates and accusers.
Cotton Mather's memorable providences relating to witchcrafts and possessions from 1689 detailed the supposed bewitchment of the Goodwin children in Boston by Irish Catholic Goody Glover. That book gave New Englanders a template for what a diabolical attack looked like, and the afflicted girls in Salem closely mirrored it 3 years later. It is also the only narrative with information about the Goody Glover case, and no court records are preserved.
Deodat Lawson's publication, Christ's Fidelity, the Only Shield Against Satan's Malignity, during the witch trials of 1692, was a sermon published just weeks after his visit to Salem Village, capturing the terror as it unfolded. And then the turning point in Increase Mather's Cases of Conscience, also in 1692, he urged caution and argued that the devil could appear in the shape of innocent people, which effectively invalidated the Court of Oyer and Terminer's use of spectral evidence.
However, Increase's son Cotton Mather went the other direction with his The Wonders of the Invisible World, published in 1692 but dated to 1693, which was written at the governor's request as the sole authorized publication on the Salem witch trials. His formulated account was a defense of the Salem judges, pushing the narrative that an army of devils had indeed launched a plot against the churches of New England.
And there were critics who held the trials accountable. Thomas Mall, a Quaker, published his Truth Held Forth and Maintained in 1695. He argued the trials were a divine judgment against New England's rulers for their earlier persecution of Quakers.
John Hale, a minister who had initially supported the trials, wrote a modest inquiry into the nature of witchcraft and later recognized that innocent people had been condemned through the court's errors. And Robert Califf's More Wonders of the Invisible World of 1700 was a stinging counterpoint to Cotton Mather. Califf demanded accountability, documented the recantations of confessors who admitted they had lied to save their lives, and attacked the theology that gave the devil so much power.
Witch trials in colonial America and Europe were characterized by strict adherence to contemporary legal procedures, formal indictments, judicial examinations, and the systematic recording of the witness testimonies. No hysteria. Hysteria does not accurately describe witch trials in the early modern era. They were highly bureaucratic, legal operations rather than instances of wild, uncontrolled mobs taking over the courts.
We mentioned the first English Witchcraft Act of 1542 during the reign of King Henry VIII that made some acts of witchcraft a secular felony, while the English and British acts kept evolving after that.
The Witchcraft Act of 1563 passed during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. It prescribed the death penalty by hanging only if the accused had used witchcraft to kill someone, murder by witchcraft. For lesser offenses, the punishment was more merciful, typically up to a year in prison and periodic public penance in the stocks or pillory.
Then the Witchcraft Act of 1603 under King James I lowered the bar. It made it a felony to consult, covenant with, or entertain evil or familiar spirits, whether or not any physical harm was proven. That formalized the diabolical pact into English law, and it heavily influenced later colonial hunts like Salem, which heavily accused alleged witches of murder by diabolical witchcraft.
Then the 1735 Act repealed the earlier legislation and effectively decriminalized witchcraft in Great Britain. It redefined the crime as fraudulent charlatanism, punishing those who falsely claim to have magical powers.
Scotland and Ireland were under their own laws. The 1563 Scottish Witchcraft Act, signed by Mary, Queen of Scots, was heavily influenced by Calvinism and much broader and harsher than the English version. It allowed execution for virtually any witchcraft offense, typically by strangulation followed by burning. The 1586 Irish Act essentially copied the English Act of 1563, and it was not repealed until 1821.
And then the American colonial laws. The 1641 Massachusetts Body of Liberties established witchcraft as a capital crime, stating that if any man or woman be a witch, that is, hath or consulteth with a familiar spirit, they shall be put to death.
The Colonies law was heavily influenced by biblical scripture and directly cited verses such as Leviticus 20:27, Deuteronomy 18:10-11, and Exodus 22:18, which famously commands, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Because Massachusetts followed English common law, the crime of witchcraft was treated as a felony punishable by hanging rather than by burning. And colonial Connecticut's codes of 1642 and 1650 banned witchcraft based on English and Massachusetts law, citing Exodus 22:18, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," along with Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Connecticut eventually dropped its act prohibiting witchcraft when its laws were reconstituted in 1750.
Witchcraft trials in Virginia and New York were significantly different due to their unique legal frameworks and cultural backgrounds. Virginia was bound strictly by secular English statutes rather than local religious laws. Because of this, witchcraft was treated as a secular crime where punishment depended entirely on the alleged harm caused. These Virginia witch trials ran 1626 to 1730.
This meant the accused witches could face a misdemeanor for minor offenses like fortune telling, or a felony for serious allegations like causing death. Because colonial governors were hesitant to prosecute capital cases, the vast majority of Virginia's witchcraft cases were actually slander suits, where individuals sued neighbors for defaming them with witch accusations.
In Virginia's most famous 1706 case of Grace Sherwood, the Witch of Pungo, they resorted to a trial by water, ducking her in the river.
But we don't know the outcome because the records were lost or destroyed. Similarly, because Maryland never enacted its own colonial witchcraft legislation, the colony relied directly on the English Witchcraft Act of 1603 to prosecute suspected witches. Consequently, when Rebecca Fowler and John Cowman were convicted under this strict English statute, their fates were determined by secular colonial authorities who executed Fowler, but spared Cowman's life so he could continue working off his indenture through hard labor.
Meanwhile, New York's approach was heavily shaped by its origins as the Dutch colony of New Netherlands. Historically, Dutch settlers generally did not try each other for witchcraft.
Even after the English took control, that strong Dutch influence remained. When settlers were accused, magistrates walked a fine line to appease angry neighbors, and the cases almost always led to acquittals without anyone being sentenced to death.
Because of this leniency, New York frequently became a safe refuge for accused witches fleeing execution. Several suspects escaping neighboring Connecticut's harsh trials, including Judith Farlett and Catherine Harrison, fled across the border to establish new lives in New York.
Colonial Pennsylvania had a legal system based on Quaker theology that prioritized strict evidence and minimized capital offenses. William Penn's 1682 founding legal code, the Great Law, deliberately omitted witchcraft in colonial Pennsylvania. In 1684, this approach led to the acquittal of Margaret Matson, the colony's only known accused witch, with the court finding her guilty only of the non-criminal reputation of a witch.
By 1718, the British Crown pressured Pennsylvania to align its unusually lenient legal system with harsher English statutes. That year, the Pennsylvania Assembly passed the Act for the Advancement of Justice, which formally adopted England's 1604 Witchcraft Act. This officially made witchcraft a capital offense punishable by death. The law was a political formality to appease the crown, and authorities simply didn't use it. No one was ever executed that we know of, and the law was quietly repealed in the 1750s.
We can estimate that roughly up to 4,500 victims were executed under these specific English, Scottish, Irish, and American colonial witchcraft laws.
Under the centralized bureaucratic framework of Spanish, civil, and inquisitorial law, later American territories like New Mexico and Louisiana treated witchcraft as superstition or secular fraud, demanding rigorous physical proof of harm rather than accepting spectral evidence. Under this Spanish civil and inquisitorial law, territories like New Mexico and Louisiana handled allegations of witchcraft, brujeria, and magical charms grigri through a fundamentally different legal paradigm than the English colonies.
When we zoom out to the whole continent of Europe, the age of the European witch trials ran from about 1400 to 1775 and ended in an estimated 40 to 50,000 executions. Over a third to half of those happened in the German-speaking territories of the Holy Roman Empire.
Countries with highly centralized judicial systems like France saw fewer executions because convictions could be appealed to higher courts. The fragmented governance in the German regions let local commissioners yield to intense public pressure without any oversight from above.
European women were disproportionately targeted, about 80 to 85% of the victims. That imbalance was driven by the late medieval demonologies, the Malleus most of all, which claimed women were more susceptible to the devil through lust, foolishness, and a lack of faith, though there were regional exceptions. In Iceland, 90% of those accused were men, and in Finland, just over half of the accused were men.
And the panics were fueled by real-world stress. The Little Ice Age brought devastating crop failures and climate change, and that landed on top of warfare and the severe religious tensions of the Reformation. A witchcraft accusation offered a convenient and accessible explanation for sudden illness, failed harvests, and deadly epidemics.
On the continent, witchcraft was prosecuted as a religious heresy and an exceptional crime, crimen exceptum. Because a confession was viewed as the ultimate proof, authorities used brutal torture to extract admissions to impossible crimes. Under that duress, innocent people confessed to flying, to attending sabbaths, to intercourse with demons, to consuming infants.
And while England and its colonies hanged the convicted, on the continent and in Scotland, they were frequently burned at the stake. Sometimes the person was beheaded or strangled first, but the burning itself was considered an essential theological act to completely cleanse the body that had supposedly been sullied by the devil.
In England specifically, because witchcraft was a secular felony under common law, suspects got a jury, couldn't be legally tortured, and were hanged rather than burned. And the texture of English belief was different too. The typical English trial centered on maleficium, magic used to harm a neighbor, their children, or their livestock.
The English were far less focused on the Sabbath, the orgiastic gatherings with the devil that obsessed continental writers. Instead, English belief placed enormous emphasis on familiar spirits, demonic entities in forms of animals, cats, mice, toads, and snails that supposedly fed from witches' marks or teats on the accused's body and carried out their harmful bidding.
And many English communities actively relied on cunning folk, who practiced service magic for healing, finding lost goods, removing perceived curses. But zealous Puritan authorities argued that apparently good magic users were actually the most dangerous kind, because any supernatural power not directly from God must come from the devil.
England executed far fewer people than Scotland or Germany, but it still had devastating local panics. St. Osy in Essex in 1582 escalated when a magistrate named Brian Darcy bullied a woman named Ursula Kemp into tears and a confession about animal familiars, and that swept up about 20 people.
The Pendle trials in Lancashire, there were two waves in 1612 and 1634. In 1612, 10 people were executed. In 1634, a young boy named Edmund Robinson claimed witches had taken him to a gathering, which led to about 20 arrests, until King Charles I interviewed the boy himself and discovered he was lying. That exposed the danger of using children as witnesses, a practice King James I had previously authorized, precisely because physical evidence for witchcraft was so hard to come by.
The East Anglian panics were 1645 to 1647 during the English Civil War. This war led to the breakdown in centralized legal authority, and that made the way for self-proclaimed witch-finder General Matthew Hopkins and his associate John Stern to run a brutal campaign across eastern England. The towns paid Hopkins for finding their witches, and he got around torture bans through sleep deprivation, mainly watching, keeping suspects awake for days to break them down, or wait for a familiar to appear. That campaign produced roughly 200 to 300 executions.
The Newcastle trials in 1649 to 1650 brought in a Scottish professional witch pricker who used a bodkin pin to test suspected devil's marks on 30 people and declared 15 of them guilty. On August 21st, 1650, those 15 people, 14 women and 1 man, were hanged on a specially built oversized gallows in the largest single execution for witchcraft in English history. The pricker was later exposed as a fraud who had collected 20 shillings per witch, but his identity is lost to history.
Over time, authorities recognized that witchcraft was impossible to prove physically and that spectral evidence was completely unreliable. The Witchcraft Act of 1735 decriminalized it. Instead of punishing people for practicing dark arts, this statute transformed witchcraft into a secular crime of fraud and deception. Anyone who falsely claimed to have magical powers, tell fortunes, cast spells, or contact spirits was prosecuted as a con artist. But the belief didn't end. England saw what are referred to as reverse witch trials, where accused people used the courts to sue their attackers for slander or assault. Additionally, extra-legal violence, like scratching a suspected witch to draw blood and break a spell, kept harming innocent people into the 19th and 20th centuries and beyond.
Scotland is a place where witch hunting turned uniquely severe. They executed alleged witches at roughly 5 to 10 times the rate of England. Out of a population of just under 1 million, an estimated 2,000 to 4,000 people were executed, but the actual number is unknown because the records are incomplete. About 85% of the executed victims were women.
Before the Protestant Reformation, magical practitioners in Scotland, the healers and charmers, were common and usually associated with fairies rather than demons. That changed with the Scottish Witchcraft Act of 1563. The Reformation brought a strict Calvinism, led by figures like John Knox, that viewed the devil as a literal, immediate threat. And Knox's theology was deeply patriarchal. He believed power was unnatural to a woman, so any woman with power must have gotten it from Satan.
And King James VI, before he was James I of England, validated all of it. After blaming witches for conjuring a storm to drown his bride at sea, he wrote Demonology in 1597 to prove witches existed and establish sufficient proofs for magistrates to convict them. Because the king wrote it, the general population largely accepted it as the truth.
The torture was routine in a way it wasn't routine in England, and the courts often employed professional, highly paid witch prickers who would shave and strip the accused and repeatedly jab them with long pins to find the devil's mark, a spot that supposedly wouldn't bleed or feel pain.
There's a striking discrepancy in how the courts treated women versus men, who were known as warlocks rather than witches. Under Scottish law, women weren't permitted to speak in court in their own defense, except to delate, meaning to accuse another woman of witchcraft. Men were allowed to speak and defend themselves, so they had a much higher acquittal rate and frequently received the uniquely Scottish verdict of not proven, which meant the Crown failed to prove its case and the accused was released.
The convicted were typically strangled to death with a rope while tied to a stake, and then their bodies were burned, often in tar barrels. The burning was theological because the witch was believed to have renounced their faith and sworn a pact with the devil. Authorities wanted nothing of them to remain. The fires burned for days in public marketplaces, and the ashes were sometimes thrown into the rivers, like the River Tweed, to keep the reincarnated spirits from returning.
There were several distinct waves of Scottish trials. The People's Trials in 1629 in the Borders region, where 27 people were accused, 20 women, 6 men, and a 15-year-old girl. 24 were executed in a single day and 3 more shortly after. In the Lothian's Panic of 1661 and 1662, during immense political upheaval, local rural courts bypassed the required legal commissions.
The Bargarin hunt in Paisley in 1697 was sparked by the accusation of an 11-year-old girl named Christian Shaw, whose afflictions closely mirrored the Boston and Salem girls' fits. It resulted in 35 people interrogated and 7 executed at the Gallows Green in Paisley, the last major mass execution for witchcraft in Western Europe.
Today, groups like Witches of Scotland and Remembering the Accused Witches of Scotland have successfully lobbied for historical justice. On International Women's Day in 2022, former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon issued a formal posthumous apology on behalf of the Scottish government, and the Church of Scotland followed with its own apology shortly after. British and Scottish advocates continue to campaign for a national memorial and a pardon.
Wales had a completely different pattern. Only 5 recorded cases ended in death sentences, and yet the records from the Welsh Court of Great Sessions are nearly all intact, which gives a rare, detailed look at the accusations and the people involved.
There are a few theories for why Wales saw so few executions. Some historians suggest the Welsh were more likely to blame fairies, known as the Tylwyth Teg, the fair folk, for misfortune, rather than witches. This is similar to pre-Reformation Scotland. Others point to language differences and how the word witch translated. Welsh culture held on to residual Catholic beliefs long after it was officially supposed to be Protestant, so charms, blessings, and pilgrimages were embedded in everyday life, even performed by local clergy. Accusing someone of charming wasn't a unique or effective allegation when it was so commonplace.
The Welsh relied heavily on local wise women for healing and held a dual view of magic where witches could inflict harm, but were also trusted to heal. There's even a historical treatise, The Two Tarrying Welshmen, that's a dialogue between two men arguing over whether witches were necessary healers or inherently evil.
An accused witch in Wales could typically only be sentenced to death for serious harm or murder through magic. The most detailed case is Gwynferch Ellis, who in 1594 became the first woman hanged for witchcraft in Wales. She was a local healer, and her trouble began when a member of the gentry, Thomas Mostyn, accused her of leaving a curse in his home on a piece of paper with letters written backwards.
And because Mostyn was a man of higher rank, this accusation was taken seriously, and it snowballed. It escalated to a charge that she had murdered a boy through witchcraft after she had told his family she could have saved him if they had brought him to her sooner. Her trial records have this tragic detail. The word ignoramus was initially written on her indictment, meaning the grand jury was ready to throw her case out. But it was crossed out, and she was found guilty, which strongly suggests someone with influence persuaded the jury. Doesn't this seem familiar? Rebecca Nurse was also initially found innocent by the jury before that jury was persuaded by Judge Stoughton that she was guilty. Gwynferch Ellis was hanged in the town square in Denbigh.
And despite those detailed records, there are no known monuments or memorials to Gwynferch Ellis or the other Welsh victims. The site of her execution in Denbigh is now simply the location of a public library.
Ireland stands out for the near absence of formal trials, only 2 major ones in the whole era. The Irish Witchcraft Act of 1586 was a direct copy of the English Elizabethan Act, using English magistrates and grand juries, but the native Gaelic Irish Catholic majority rarely made formal accusations.
They generally viewed witchcraft as a low-level threat, believing mainly in witches who shape-shifted into hares or used sympathetic magic to steal milk and butter, rather than witches making demonic pacts. To protect against those threats, communities relied on folk magic. Hagstones hung around cows' necks, hot embers in butter churns, herbs like vervain and mountain ash.
The machinery of the formal witch trials relied heavily on the Protestant legal and theological framework. Indigenous Irish Catholics rarely initiated witchcraft cases in the English-controlled civil courts. Instead, they preferred to resolve interpersonal tensions and localize supernatural anxieties internally or through the spiritual intervention of local priests.
The 2 major trials are Florence Newton in 1661, which occurred in the Puritan settler area of Youghal in Cork, which mirrored English tropes, the search for familiars and the swimming test. And the Island McGee trials of 1711, Ireland's largest, with 8 women and 1 man, William Seller, accused. This panic centered on the demonic possession of a young woman named Mary Dunbar, and much like Salem, the court relied heavily on spectral evidence and touch tests, where an afflicted person's fits would supposedly stop if they were touched by the guilty witch.
The 8 women were sentenced to prison in the pillory, but Mary Dunbar died shortly after the trial, which elevated the charges against William Seller to a capital felony, and that likely resulted in his execution too.
The Irish Witchcraft Act was repealed in 1821, but that didn't erase witchcraft belief. People could no longer legally prosecute witches, so they turned to vigilante violence, which produced a flood of reverse witch trials from the 1840s to the end of the century. There were tragic accidents too. In 1807, a cunning person named Mary Butters accidentally killed an entire family through carbon monoxide poisoning while burning sulfur in a sealed house to cure a supposedly bewitched cow. These beliefs persisted in rural areas well into the 20th century, with the last major related case in 1927.
A commemorative plaque for the Island McGee witches was recently erected, and an innovative multimedia exhibition with virtual reality, a graphic novel, and a video game launched at the Carrickfergus Museum to educate the public about the 1711 trials.
The Basque witch hunt around 1609 is one of Europe's most notorious. This took place in the border region between France and Spain, a territory marked by political conflict and scarce resources, and it ended in roughly 100 deaths, mostly by burning. The traditional story frames it as an attack by outside judges trying to demonize the region's unique culture and language, which is Europe's only language isolate. But recent research by the historian Jan Michielsen shows the panic was actually homegrown. The Basque country had a long history of witch hunting, and this one was driven heavily by internal factionalism and disputes among local communities and nobles. On the French side, in the Pays de la Borde, the local population actually requested a special commission. Normally, a French witchcraft conviction could be appealed to a higher court in Bordeaux, a 5-day journey and very expensive. By bringing in a commission with no possibility of appeal, the locals made the hunt cheaper and faster, letting judges travel village to village and prosecute suspects immediately.
The primary judge was Pierre de Lancret. The sources describe him as deeply obsessed with the devil and with the Basque women. He didn't speak the Basque language and relied on interpreters, and he scrutinized the bodies of the accused and romanticized the territory as a vulnerable feminine space easily infiltrated by Satan. He and his colleagues claimed to have prosecuted between 60 and 80 witches in just 4 months.
And largely because of de Lancret's book, the Sabbath became heavily associated with the Basque country. The testimony he gathered, much of it from children and teenagers who were acting as accusers, was more bizarre and graphic than Sabbath narratives anywhere else. Witnesses claimed Basque witches dug up dead witches from cemeteries and that the devil provided special dentures so they could eat the corpses. De Lancret was so fixated on these gatherings that he commissioned an engraving of a Sabbath for his book.
The Spanish side was completely different. Around Zagura-Murti, the trials were handled by the Spanish Inquisition, which was bureaucratic and legally minded. The inquisitors got bogged down debating whether the Sabbath was physically reality or a dream planted by the devil, and whether someone was even legally responsible if they only dreamed they attended. They also hesitated to prosecute accused witches fleeing from France because the crimes hadn't been committed on Spanish soil. That skepticism slowed the executions.
But the fear didn't resolve. It lingered for another decade and then transferred to a new group of outsiders. Around 1619, a wave of refugees crossed from Spain into France. New Christians who were descendants of Jews and Muslims who'd been forced to convert and were suspected of reverting to their ancestral faiths. The paranoia got displaced onto them, culminating in 1619 when a Portuguese refugee named Catarina Fernandes was lynched by a mob in Saint-Jean-de-Luz.
Sweden was Protestant and had notable hunts of its own. And it's had a big place in our conversations here on the podcast because it did directly influence the perception of witches during the Salem witch trials. There's a famous series of trials from the province of Elfdale where supposed witches confessed to gathering at a gravel pit, putting garments over their heads, and dancing before running to a crossroads. They said they'd called upon the devil 3 times, chanting, "Antecessor, come and carry us to Blockula."
And in those confessions, the devil would appear at the crossroads as a red-bearded man in a gray coat, red and blue stockings, long garters, and a high-crowned hat. He'd summon beasts to carry the witches to a great meadow called Blockula, where they held a Sabbath.
Those accounts fundamentally shaped the Sabbath accounts in Salem in 1692. The Blockula stories were published in the appendix to Joseph Glanville's 1681 book, Sadducismus Triumphatus, and the New Englanders were very familiar with it. It planted the idea of the Sabbath firmly in the minds of the people and prosecutors. In fact, before 1692, witches in New England had never been accused of flying. The concept of witches taking flight to diabolical gatherings was a continental Europe idea, imported through stories exactly like the ones from Sweden.
In America, Connecticut had the deadliest pre-Salem panics. The Connecticut witch trial executions took place between 1647 and 1663, with all victims being hanged in Hartford, Stratford, or Fairfield. The deadly timeline began on May 26, 1647, when Alice Young was hanged in Hartford, the first known person executed for witchcraft in the American colonies. Her identity was nearly lost to history, recorded only as a blank space in Governor John Winthrop Sr.'s journal, until it was later found in a town clerk's diary. There are no trial records preserved from the Alice Young trial.
Next Connecticut victim was a servant named Mary Johnson of Wethersfield in 1648, and then the husband and wife John and Joan Carrington in March of 1650. Executions continued throughout the decade with Goody Bassett of Stratford, Goody Knapp of Fairfield, and Lydia Gilbert of Windsor. The trials culminated during the Hartford Witch Panic, which saw Mary Sanford indicted and hanged in June of 1662. Finally, on a snowy January 25th in 1663, Mary Barnes and a married couple, Nathaniel and Rebecca Greensmith, were led to the gallows in Hartford.
Connecticut was the deadliest colony before Salem, hanging 11 people in total. Executions were eventually halted, largely due to the efforts of Governor John Winthrop Jr., who used the requirement of 2 eyewitnesses to the same incident to secure any capital conviction. In May 2023, the state passed House Joint Resolution 34, officially absolving all 34 indicted victims of the Connecticut witch trials by name.
Massachusetts had a long history of witch trials. Between 1648 and 1693, over 200 people were formally charged with witchcraft in Massachusetts. Margaret Jones became the first woman executed in Boston in 1648. Decades later, in 1688, Goody Glover, a Catholic immigrant, was hanged after accusations of her causing diabolical afflictions. The Massachusetts Witch Hunt Justice Project has been working to get exoneration for the Boston 8, who are those that were convicted before the Salem witch trials.
The Springfield, Massachusetts Panic of 1650 to 1651, which centered on Hugh and Mary Lewis Parsons, is widely considered America's first true witch panic. Unlike typical Puritan settlements founded by tight-knit religious congregations, Springfield was an artificially constructed company town established by William Pynchon strictly for the beaver fur trade.
Because Pynchon recruited individuals for specific skills, Hugh Parsons' coveted skill of brickmaking, settlers came from diverse backgrounds with clashing customs and dialects. This created a lack of deep communal bonds and fostered a highly competitive environment driven by economic disparity, greed, and personal grievances. When the Parsons' own bitter marital strife and the tragic, unexplained deaths of local children heightened the town's anxieties, this uniquely tense and fractured community inevitably erupted into this witch panic.
Of course, the largest, deadliest, and most culturally significant panic in American history is the Salem witch trials, which resulted in 25 deaths, with 19 people hanged, Giles Corey pressed to death under stones for refusing to stand trial, and 5 people died in jail, including 4 adults awaiting trial and an infant of Sarah Good. The Salem witch panic began when young girls, including Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, started experiencing violent fits in the home of Reverend Samuel Paris. And the crisis was the result of a perfect storm. The Massachusetts Bay Colony had lost its Royal English Charter. Residents were terrified by deadly attacks during a war called King William's War, and that landed alongside smallpox, economic anxiety, and major church disputes. Powerful ministers like Cotton Mather fueled it by declaring that an army of devils was literally conspiring to tear down the Puritan churches.
Royal Governor William Phips created the Emergency Court of Oyer Interpreter under Chief Justice William Stoughton, and that court fatally allowed spectral evidence, testimony that the invisible spirit or shape of the accused was attacking the afflicted.
The panic was uniquely indiscriminate. It targeted even the colonial elite, like the Mayflower descendant Captain John Alden, the son of John and Priscilla Alden, who came over on that ship. And it spread far beyond Salem. The town of Andover actually saw the most accusations, 45, after afflicted girls were brought from Salem Village up to Andover to diagnose an illness.
In late October of 1692, facing mounting public oppositions and warnings from prominent ministers, Governor William Phips dissolved the Special Court of Oyer Interpreter. That fall, the colonial legislature established the new permanent court, the Superior Court of Judicature, which began hearing cases in January of 1693. Crucially, this new court officially barred the use of spectral evidence, which had previously been the primary basis for securing guilty verdicts. Without the admission of supernatural testimony, the court acquitted nearly all remaining suspects. The final three who were convicted confessors and scheduled for execution were quickly reprieved by the governor, and their surviving prisoners were released once they paid their jail fees.
Witch trials extended far beyond Salem, Massachusetts, into other areas of New England. In Hampton, New Hampshire, an impoverished, childless, and outspoken woman named Eunice Cole became a frequent target, facing witchcraft accusations multiple times over 3 decades. Because New Hampshire fell under Massachusetts' legal jurisdiction at the time, she was actually transported to Boston to be tried, whipped, and imprisoned. Remarkably, centuries later in 1938, the town of Hampton held a massive public ceremony to finally clear her name. They declared Goody Coal Day, symbolically burned certified copies of her trial documents, and placed the ashes in an urn that is preserved in a local museum today.
In Pownell, Vermont, around 1785, a decade after the American Revolution, widow Margaret Krieger was accused by her neighbors. The Kriegers were a Germanic family and likely British loyalists living among the English patriots, which would have added intense political tension. A local safety committee subjected Margaret to the water test in the icy Hoosic River, but she was pulled out alive and declared innocent.
The end of formal state-sanctioned trials in the West didn't end witch hunting. It opened an era of extrajudicial violence and reverse witch trials across the 18th and 19th centuries. Though the laws were repealed, large portions of the population still believe in and deeply fear witches and take matters into their own hands.
Many of these victims never went to the authorities and suffered in silence. In one tragic example from the 1870s, an elderly woman who was admitted to a British asylum was found to have a badly scarred back with lacerations from being repeatedly scratched by people who suspected her of witchcraft. Historians note that more people have been extrajudicially killed as witches in America after the Salem witch trials than ever were executed by authorities during formal colonial trials. They've been beaten, shot, slandered through the 18th, 19th, and into the mid-20th century.
The accusations kept coming for over a century after Salem. In Virginia in 1706, Grace Sherwood, the so-called Witch of Pungo, sued her neighbors for slander after they claimed she'd bewitched their cotton and pigs and ridden a woman like a horse before turning herself into a cat. In Connecticut, decades after the colony's final executions, formal slander suits were still being filed. Sarah Clother and Goodwife Brown in 1713, Sarah Spencer in 1714, Elizabeth Gould in 1742, and as late as 1801, a Vermont Gazette article recalled that in the 1760s and 1770s, it was still commonplace to blame accidents and overturn carts on local witches.
And in 19th century Ireland, the belief stayed robust of witches transforming into hares, using the evil eye, stealing butter and milk, or harming cattle. Following the 1821 repeal of the Irish Witchcraft Act of 1586, the Irish legal system ceased to recognize witchcraft as a reality, shifting instead to prosecuting practitioners for secular crimes like fraud, theft, and fortune-telling. Deep-rooted supernatural beliefs persisted among rural communities. Because courts would no longer try witches, local communities took matters into their own hands, resulting in a wave of civil lawsuits for assault, slander, and malicious property damage driven by these lingering superstitions.
And witch hunts are not relics of the past. They are an escalating global crisis unfolding in at least 60 nations right now. Historian Wolfgang Behringer has observed that more people are dying in witch hunts today than at any point in recorded human history.
Real numbers bear this out. Between 2009 and 2019, the United Nations documented at least 20,000 victims of accusation-related violence, and that figure is regarded as a fraction of the true total because many cases are not reported. In Tanzania alone, upwards of 30,000 people have been killed since 1961. In India, thousands more. Economist Boris Gershman found that roughly 40% of the world's population believes in harmful witchcraft, a belief shared by 16% of Americans.
Gershman arrived at his findings by compiling a massive global dataset from 6 waves of Pew Research Center surveys that were conducted between 2008 and 2017. These surveys captured responses from over 140,000 individuals across 95 countries and territories. Using that data, he ran a 2-part analysis at both the individual and the country level, examining how socio-demographic factors such as age, gender, education, and religion, along with the society's overall level of traditionalism and conformity, correlate with belief in witchcraft.
What is causing witch hunts today? Gershman is careful to note that his is a descriptive study built on correlation analysis, meaning it identifies factors associated with witchcraft belief rather than establishing direct cause and effect. With that qualification in mind, his findings suggest that accusations are rooted in a worldview that attributes natural misfortune to magic, and that they are frequently bound up with human emotions like jealousy and envy over another person's success.
An accusation typically escalates into active persecution only when it gathers a critical mass of community consensus. Gershman theorizes that the accusations serve an underlying social function. In societies that lack strong formal institutions, the threat of being targeted becomes a tool for social control, using fear to force conformity and hold a fragile order in place.
And this is not an old fear wearing modern clothes. The legal logic, the demonology that drove the courtrooms of the early modern period, it runs in an unbroken line to the accusations being made this year. The mechanisms are strikingly consistent across 4 centuries and 6 continents.
The triggers are the same ones that haunted the early modern village: an unexplained death, the illness no one can account for, a failed harvest, a flood. Where economic strain, climate pressure, or political instability sharpens the fear, a scapegoat is still irresistible. In the past, these moved through established courts and legal processes. Today, they take 2 forms: sometimes a sudden mob, sometimes a slower and deliberate persecution. Both are very much a present reality.
There is profit in it too. Self-styled prophets, pastors, and witch-finders gain wealth and standing in their communities by naming a witch or diagnosing possession, and the accused is, so often, a child or an older person. It's always somebody vulnerable. And where the state should intervene, it routinely fails to acknowledge, prevent, investigate, or hold someone accountable. That silence sustains the violence.
International bodies now name 2 related horrors. The first is accusation, which brings attack and banishment upon the accused. The second is ritual attack, in which body parts are taken for supposed fortune, a cruelty that falls hardest on persons with albinism and disproportionately on children. And the targets across both are overwhelmingly the most vulnerable: children and women, widows and the elderly, the poor and the lower caste, people living with dementia or illness their neighbors do not understand.
Consider one recent victim. In July of 2020, in the village of Kafaba, Ghana, a 92-year-old woman named Akua Denteh was accused by a local priest of causing drought and misfortune. She was beaten to death in daylight while neighbors looked on. The killing was filmed, and the footage forced a national reckoning. 2 of her attackers were eventually convicted. Yet, 5 years later, no law criminalizes the accusation itself, and more than 500 people, mostly older women, still live in exile in shrine settlements. You may have heard them called witch camps.
And here's what the statistics never capture. When advocates visited one of those camps, the women there sang and clapped and wished them a safe journey home. People stripped of everything, branded and banished, who still refused to be reduced to the worst thing ever said about them. That is the voice we keep at the center, not victims only, but survivors and witnesses.
And Ghana's missing law is not the exception. It is closer to the rule. Step back, and the legal map is a patchwork of contradictions where what is written and what is enforced rarely move together. Take South Africa. Its Witchcraft Suppression Act of 1957 was modeled on the British Act of 1735. It makes it an offense to accuse someone of witchcraft, but it also criminalizes claiming supernatural powers or identifying as a witch. The South African Law Reform Commission has recommended repealing it in favor of a bill prohibiting harmful practices, though the advocates discuss that new phrasing is complex and difficult.
Malawi's law, established by the British colonial government back in 1911, states plainly that witchcraft does not exist, and it punishes the accuser. But there is mounting pressure from bodies like the Malawi Law Commission to rewrite it so that the law legally recognizes witchcraft as real, a change advocates warn would unleash a surge of violence.
Nigeria carries colonial era provisions against accusation, but advocates note they live mostly on paper and are rarely enforced. And in India, there's no central national law against witch hunting at all. Several states, among them Bihar, Jharkhand, Maharashtra, and Odisha, have passed their own measures against black magic, superstition, or witch branding, but they are riddled with inconsistency and weak enforcement, and the penalties aren't stopping it.
In some states, the act of branding a woman a witch, the very accusation that gets people killed, carries as little as 3 months in jail. And yet, even where the law does next to nothing, survivors take up the fight themselves. In what is now Jharkhand in 1995, a woman named Chutni Mahato was branded a witch after a child in her village fell ill. A mob came for her that same night. She was beaten, nearly killed, and she fled with her children for her life. But she did not vanish into silence. She has since rescued more than 100 accused women, and in 2021, India awarded her the Padma Shri, the country's fourth highest civilian honor, for the work.
All of this raises a hard question about how the world chooses to remember the dead it does not acknowledge. Local memorials are spreading. Scotland has dozens, Germany nearly as many, and Salem has long led the way in America. But there is still no official national memorial to witch trial victims anywhere on Earth. Scotland offered a formal government apology in 2022, yet its national monument remains a campaign rather than a reality. England has plaques and little more. And here at home, Connecticut absolved its victims in 2023 without yet building a place to honor them. State and national acknowledgments are absent.
There is movement, though. The remembrance missing in stone exists, at least in time. Since 2020, every 10th of August has been observed as World Day Against Witch Hunts, established by the International Catholic Mission Society, Missio. The date is not arbitrary. It marks the day in 2012 when a young mother in Papua New Guinea, known as Christina, survived days of torture after her village accused her of sorcery, before an advocate named Sister Lorena Janal brought her to safety.
World Day Against Witch Hunts exists to honor her survival, but to connect advocates across borders and to keep this crisis in plain view. Please put this day, August 10th, on your calendar and plan on publicly honoring the day with an action or social media share.
In 2021, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted Resolution 47.8, the first instrument of its kind urging every member state to end these practices and to protect the accused.
And this is where 200 episodes have been leading us to the present. The fear is a near perfect mirror of the past. Witch hunting and witchcraft law around the world are layered, contradictory, and complicated because accusation and what is legal and what is actually enforced always travel together.
Yet underneath all of it sits the single principle this entire crisis denies, that every person branded a witch is precisely that, a person. Restoring them to that truth, the living and the dead alike, is the work.
So now that you've heard all of this, would you like to know what you could possibly do?
More than you think. The hardest part, the learning, is already gathered for you. For years, we've sat down with the historians, the advocates, the legal scholars, and the survivors who carry this knowledge from the inside. And every one of these conversations lives in our catalog. That is where to begin, not with a distant textbook, but with the voices of people who have given their lives to this work.
So listen across our shows from the courtrooms of 1692 to a village square last year. Each episode is a door into the same long story and to the experts still addressing it. You will not find a fuller place to understand both how we arrived here and what ending it will take. And every conversation hands you the next thread to pull, which books to read, and the cases.
Then use whatever platform you have, however modest. Share what you learn. Say the victims' names. Correct the myths when you hear them. Insist out loud that an accusation is not a verdict and that a person is never a witch. She is never the witch in folklore, literary fiction, or one portrayed as a monster by Hollywood.
When we say no one is a witch, We mean no innocent neighbor is the supernatural killer the accusation invents. We do not mean the many people who freely claim the name witch. Across the world, to call yourself a witch, a Wiccan, or a pagan is a chosen path of practice, and sometimes it means reclaimed power.
But elsewhere, that same word can kill because there it names only an evildoer who harms by occult means. So this is not a war against anyone's faith. As advocates like Nigeria's Leo Igwe insist, it is violence against the innocent, and the goal is a world where belief is free and no accusation is ever fatal.
We cannot reach back and save the early modern dead. We can refuse to let the living be erased in the same way. The work belongs to all of us, and it begins the moment you decide to take action.
Awareness cannot grow without voices. The ones who came before us, the ones filling the space now, and the ones still to come. We are grateful for all of them, and we are not done. If this work matters to you, help us carry it. With your voice, with your expertise, with your time, with your giving. Get involved at inwitchhunts.org, and remember that your voice can always be used with the people that you already know. Maybe you don't have a large social media platform, but you know people, you work with people, you have friends, you have family you can discuss things with. And just talking about what's happening with witch hunts around the world spreads that awareness. And every person who learns about it and gets involved is another hand, helping to bring witch hunting to an end. And as always, have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.